with that, as you can see on the screens, we are in a series on the book of Ruth, which is a very small book in your Old Testament, tucked away in between the books of Judges and the book of 1 Samuel. I want to do a quick recap before we dive into week 2 of our little mini-series on the book of Ruth. If you were here last week, you may remember that this phrase is what started our story. We'll throw it on the screen. The phrase is, in the days when the judges ruled. In the days when the judges ruled. That is the first sentence you read when you get to the book of Ruth in your Old Testament. And I indicated last time that when the author starts the story that way, it's kind of like if I started a story by saying, hey, when the COVID-19 pandemic was at its craziest point. Or it's like if I started a story by saying, back when slavery was still being practiced in North America. Right away, when I start stories that way, your brain goes to a scary, sad, and unfortunate place. You may start thinking of hospitals that were overwhelmed. You may start thinking of people that you lost during the pandemic. Or for the second example, you start going back to a time and a place in your brain when you're thinking about how human life was devalued on the basis of race. It's these moments and these time periods that we, quite frankly, don't want to think about. Well, that phrase on the screen is no different. In the days when the judges ruled was a dark, a sad, an immoral, and an unjust time period. And that is the time period when Ruth lives. And yet, even though her story starts sad, it ends with a version of happily ever after. If you remember from last week, we studied the character of Naomi, who she starts by feeling real broken and burdened, but then by the end, everybody's calling her blessed. And part of the reason for that was because of a guy named Boaz, who his generosity and his sacrificial love is literally meant to remind readers, hey, think about Jesus. Like, doesn't this guy kind of remind you about Jesus? And then you're not supposed to just think about what Boaz did for Naomi, but you're supposed to think about what Jesus has done for you. But the other character who we didn't talk much about last week is Ruth. And by many accounts, Ruth was, to the Israelite people, at least to the people who mainly read her story, Ruth was an ordinary foreign woman who lived on, for us, she lived on the other side of the world thousands of years ago. She didn't have money. She didn't have power. The narrative doesn't indicate whether she was particularly pretty or intelligent, not necessarily any standout strengths at first. And yet, more people admire and talk about Ruth today than many of history's most powerful and successful people from all time. If you just think of the most famous athletes in the world, whoever you look up to, you think of the actors and the actresses who kind of dominate the red carpet. You think of musicians who their music is on top of the charts. If you think of creatives or influencers who have millions of followers, I don't mean this as a shot, but all of those people are being talked about, and they will be talked about perhaps for another generation or two, but that's it. Society will not be admiring them at large in the masses across the world for that long after they're gone. But Ruth's story is different. Her story has been told around the world for thousands of years. And I think if you want to be successful, if you want to acquire influence for yourself, and I'm not even saying that's a bad thing. Like if you just, you want kind of to achieve your definition of success in life, you should study people who have achieved that. You should study the entertainers and the entrepreneurs of our day and kind of go, okay, what did they do that I could do in my own life? But if you want to leave a legacy that extends beyond national borders for generations, and if you want your life story to intersect with what God is doing in the whole world, well, then I would say study Ruth. Because the life of Ruth is basically a crash course in how to follow God when he's hard to find and how to create a legacy that the world remembers. But her strategy is very different than what most of us would expect. And this morning, I just want to briefly show you 3 scenes and make one point. Scene 1, loyalty. This is a collection of verses from chapter 1 of the book of Ruth. It says, Naomi said to her 2 daughter-in-laws, go back, each of you, to your mother's home. May the Lord show you kindness as you have shown kindness to your dead husbands and to me. I'm skipping a few verses to get to Ruth's response. She replied, don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates me from you. If you recall the narrative that we discussed a little bit last week, the book opens with Naomi and her husband Elimelech. Naomi and her husband Elimelech have 2 sons, and they all move to the land of Moab. Both sons get married to 2 women from the land of Moab, but within a 10-year period, Naomi's husband, Elimelech, he dies, and then both of Naomi's sons die as well. So Naomi is left with just 2 daughters-in-law. And she tells these young women, hey, your best chance at success is to basically go back to your family's home and try to start over. One of the girls takes her advice, but the other daughter, that's Ruth. And Ruth decides she isn't going anywhere, and she essentially tells Naomi, wherever you go, I will go. We're in this together. Which is a big deal because you got to remember, Ruth's husband just died. She has also experienced the tragedy and the loss. And this moment in the narrative, this is her chance to kind of run away and get a do-over at life. If you've ever gone through a difficult season, if you've ever had something really challenging happen to you, you know that when you kind of get to the other end of that season, it's a awesome opportunity to kind of hit a restart and to get a do-over at life, to focus on, this is Ruth's chance to focus on what she wants and what she needs, but that's not what she does. Instead, she decides to stay with her mother-in-law as an act of loyal love. And when you consider the fact that Ruth's life made the pages of history, I have to wonder if one of the ways you and I can change the world is by loving the people in our world. To be specific, based off the example in the narrative, how are we loving those who are closest to us, like our family members? Because a lot of times when we think of leaving a legacy behind, we think of the amazing actions that we can do for people way out there. But the example of Ruth is just being loyal to the people who are closest. I think one of my favorite moments from camp this year, if you were there, was there was a moment when Pastor Gary, we were going to pray over like student relationships with parents and stuff. And he basically gave a piece of advice. He suggested that if you want a better relationship with your parents, you stop using the word good to describe how your day was. That at the end of the day, when you see your parent after school or after church or whatever it is, and they go, hey, how was your day? How was that event? How was your time with so-and-so? Just don't use the word good. Just become more creative in your responses to them, because good all by itself usually isn't going to develop a relationship. Or when it comes to siblings, siblings are likely the people who you are most comfortable with, but they're also the people who you're going to get most annoyed by, and you're going to have like probably some of your biggest arguments with. So I'm not going to paint an idealized version of your relationship, but I do want to challenge us to consider the question, what would it look like for you? What would it look like for me to be a little bit more loving towards the people who are closest to us? Regardless of how they act or respond, what does it look like for me to get better at loving, forgiving, and caring about the people in my world? That's scene 1. Here's scene 2. Scene 2, I'm titling Diligence. Collection of verses from chapter 2. Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, let me go to the fields and pick up the leftover grain behind anyone in whose eyes I find favor. Naomi said to her, go ahead, my daughter. While she is out there, Ruth gets noticed by Boaz and by the manager of his field. And Boaz has a question for the overseer. He asked the overseer of his harvesters, who does that young woman belong to? The overseer replied, she is the Moabite who came back from Moab with Naomi. She said, please let me glean and gather among the sheaves behind the harvesters. She came into the field and has remained here from morning till now, except for a short rest in the shelter. So by chapter 2, Ruth and Naomi, they are back in Naomi's homeland. Remember, they were in Moab and then everyone died, so they go back to Naomi's homeland. But if you were a single woman in the ancient world, you had very little opportunity for work. Even though Ruth and Naomi, they need a way to put food on the table, Ruth cannot just submit a job application at the local marketplace and hope for the best. That's not the way the world worked at this time. So what she does is she gleans. Gleaning was essentially the act of gathering up all the leftovers in a field. If you read the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 24, you can see how God gave the nation a rule. This is literally how God sets up his society, is he says, hey, when you're harvesting your fields, don't take everything that's there to take, but leave some stuff behind for the poor and the marginalized people to find food. And that's what Ruth signs herself up for. Hey, Naomi, can I go beg for food? And once she's out in the field, She apparently works so hard that some of the other field workers notice her, and they describe her as the woman who's only taken one break all day. And when you consider the fact that Ruth's actions are still being talked about today, again, almost 3,000 years after she lived, I have to wonder if the way you and I can make our mark on the world is by working really hard at whatever opportunity is in front of us. I think Ruth is really inspiring because she doesn't just wait for a better opportunity. She just treats the opportunity that she has like it really matters. And I know that a huge temptation for young people is to think of your current season of life as your waiting season, as if all you do right now is just kind of wait for better opportunity in the future when you can step into college, career, relationships, and then enjoy the life that you're envisioning. But for many of us, my guess is that there are a couple areas of our life where the things we need isn't more opportunity, but it's to take more responsibility for what God has already entrusted to us. The way we currently spend our money and our time, the way we value the family and the friends that we do have, the way that we dedicate ourselves to things like school, chores, sports, and other extracurriculars, all those things matter because they are the things that God has given us to steward in this season of our lives. So do not make the mistake of overlooking and undervaluing them because they don't seem significant right now. Scene 3, wisdom. From chapter 3, one day, Ruth's mother-in-law, Naomi, said to her, "My daughter, I must find a home for you where you will be well provided for." And in verse 5, Ruth responds, "I'll do whatever you say." Verse 6, so she went down to the threshing floor and did everything her mother-in-law told her to do. And then while she's down there, she has an interaction with Boaz. And this is his response to her in verse 10. He says, "The Lord bless you, my daughter. This kindness that she has shown to him is greater than that which you showed earlier. You have not run after the younger men, whether rich or poor." So chapter 3, Ruth and Naomi are back in the homeland, and now Ruth and Naomi have more than enough food to eat because Ruth diligently worked at the opportunities that she had. She found favor. Naomi and her have enough food to eat. And after a while, Naomi has kind of, it seems like, processed a little bit of the grief that she has experienced, and she has a favorable disposition towards her daughter. So she tells her daughter-in-law, "Hey, I want to help get you married." And as you can imagine, Ruth is like, "That's a great idea. I love this idea." And I skipped over the specific details of Naomi's plan because what I want to focus on is Ruth's response. She says, "I'll do whatever you say. Whatever you want to do, let's do it." And verse 6 says that that's what Ruth did. You can read the story, but Ruth practically proposes to Boaz. And in verse 10, it records his response. And I just want you to notice at the end, he says, "You have not run after the younger men, whether rich or poor." Now, I highlight that statement because I want to make a pastoral note from it. Ruth does not pick her significant other just based off her desire and how she feels. Those things are involved, I'm sure. But the thing that takes center stage is her getting counsel from other people and her making a wise decision. Her teachability and her wisdom in the moment. It is her listening to the advice of someone wiser and then her making a decision not just with her heart, but with her mind. And very often in my experience, and I think I can speak on behalf of most of Raylene and most of the team here, very often in our experience of leading and counseling young people, it's that people are usually led by every other part of their body except their brain when they are picking their partner for a relationship. As a general rule, guys tend to go after what they see, while girls tend to go after what they feel. And sometimes in Christian circles, there is this spiritual element that's added to the relationship of how much God approves of it or how much you feel like God told you to pursue this person. And if you are a Christian in the room, please pay attention because I don't want you misquoting me on this one. But at your age and stage of life, you may not need God to tell you anything about whether or not that person is right for you right now. At your age and stage of life, you may just need to submit your dating relationship to God's wisdom and to the wisdom of trusted voices in your life. I'm not saying that you shouldn't pray about your relationships, and I'm not saying that God doesn't talk to us about our relationships and who is a good fit or what is the right time. But in my experience, the most neglected aspect of young people's dating relationships, both Christians and non-Christians, It's not God, it's wisdom. Every young relationship is going to have feelings of love and passion. I promise you, you don't need to try to find those or conjure those up. They're gonna be there. When you have someone who you are emotionally attached to, you're going to feel all kinds of feelings. And very often, young Christian relationships, they even have a level of spirituality present. If you have both people who are trying to follow Jesus, there's gonna be a component of what does God want for us in this season? But is the timing and the conduct of the relationship wise? Is it actually drawing the two of you closer to God, or is it just drawing you closer to compromise, secrecy, and isolation? Because Ruth shows us a different way. She doesn't just let her feelings lead the way in a decision as important as who she's going to be with, and considering the fact that her actions are held up as a model for us to learn from. I have to wonder if the way you and I can engage in relationships that actually bless and inspire other people is by letting wisdom lead the way. Three scenes that collectively show a woman who demonstrates a level of loyalty that looks like God, a diligence that just doesn't quit, and a life of wisdom that ends up blessing other people. So to answer our question from the beginning, hey, Ruth, how do you change the world? Well, judging based off her life, I actually don't think Ruth was trying to accomplish great things. But to borrow a phrase from Mother Teresa, I think she was trying to do small things with great love. She was kind and she cared for the people in her world who were closest to her. She managed all her responsibilities well, even the things that other people said, that's insignificant. Why would you care so much about that? Why would you devote yourself to that? She still managed it well, and she made wise decisions. And when we do those things in the name of Jesus, he has a way of weaving our story into his. If you were here last week, we talked about how Ruth's story is 100% about Ruth, and it is a narrative about what this amazing woman did and the other people who played a role in her life. But it didn't just end with her. Ruth ends up marrying Boaz, and they end up having a son who becomes the grandfather of King David, who is part of the lineage of King Jesus. And what we see through Ruth's life isn't just an individual who makes good decisions and has a better life because of it, but we see an individual who makes wise decisions, and God ends up taking that life and weaving it into his story that actually ends up blessing other people, even on the other side of the world, even thousands of years later. So hopefully, when you and I look at our lives and we go, hey, I don't really have a lot of opportunities to do great things right now. And maybe you will, maybe some of us will. I'm not saying that's bad. But we're all gonna have opportunities with the people in our world, with the responsibilities that we have, and with the choices that we make. And there's something about Ruth's life that as she operates in loyalty and in diligence and in wisdom, God ends up taking that life and weaving it in to his story that blesses and saves other people as a result.